The day Kangi tore open the land deed and drove Mariah Kern from her homestead, he believed he'd claimed what was rightfully owed to him by blood and fire. But when she stepped aside and revealed two hollow-eyed boys clinging to her skirts, their ribs pressing through torn shirts like the bars of a cage, something inside the feared Apache warrior cracked wide open. What he thought would be his greatest victory became the moment that would either destroy him or save what was left of his soul. The wind carried dust and whispers across the Oklahoma Territory that autumn morning, swirling through the scattered homesteads that dotted the land like wooden gravestones. The year was 1873, and the frontier had become a patchwork of broken treaties, stolen ground, and the quiet desperation of people trying to carve out survival from unforgiving soil. In the distance, the red clay hills rose like the backs of sleeping giants, indifferent to the blood that had soaked into them over generations. Kangi rode alone, as he always did. His horse, a paint stallion with markings that resembled war paint, moved with the steady rhythm of a predator stalking prey. He wore no feathers, no ceremonial dress. Those days were long gone, burned away with his village, scattered like ash on the wind when the soldiers came. Now he wore a dusty black coat over buckskin pants, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over eyes that had seen too much death to fear it anymore. His face was carved from stone, high cheekbones and a jaw set in permanent defiance. A scar ran from his left temple to his cheek, a gift from a cavalry saber that had missed killing him by inches. They called him Kangi, the Raven, not because of any tribal ceremony or honor, but because he appeared like a dark omen before taking what he believed was owed. To the Apache, he was a ghost of what they once were. To the settlers, he was a nightmare whispered about in trading posts and around campfires. The law had tried to hang him twice. Both times he'd walked away, leaving bodies in his wake and questions that no one wanted to answer. He'd spent the last 3 years tracking down every piece of land that had been stolen from his people through false treaties and forged signatures. The government men had smiled and shaken hands while drawing lines on maps, carving up sacred ground like it was a Sunday roast. Kangi had watched his father sign a treaty under duress, watched him die shortly after from shame and whiskey. His mother had vanished into the reservation system, a number in a ledger, forgotten. His sister had been taken by sickness before she reached her 10th winter, so Kangi had become something else entirely. Not quite Apache anymore, not quite the white man's Indian. He lived in the cracks between worlds, belonging to neither, trusted by none. He'd learned their language, their laws, their way of wielding paper as a weapon sharper than any blade. And he'd discovered something that made his blood run cold with purpose. The land his father had been forced to sign away. The ground where his ancestors had hunted and prayed and raised their children had been divided up and sold to settlers who had no idea they were building their dreams on stolen earth. One of those parcels belonged to a woman named Mariah Kern. Kangi had done his research the way a hawk studies a field before diving. Mariah was a widow. Her husband dead 3 years from fever, left alone with a homestead that sat on what had once been Apache hunting grounds. The deed in Kangi's saddlebag was legitimate, or as legitimate as anything could be in a system designed to rob his people blind. He'd traded for it, purchased it through intermediaries, called in favors and debts until he held the paper that said the land was his by right of prior claim. The territorial judge, a man who owed Kangi his life after an incident involving bandits and a burning courthouse, had signed off on it without hesitation. The law might have been a weapon used against his people, but Kangi had learned to wield it just as effectively. The Kern homestead came into view as the sun climbed toward noon, heat shimmering off the packed earth. It was modest, a single-story cabin with a shingled roof that had seen better days, a small barn that leaned slightly to one side, and a corral that held no horses. Clothes hung on a line, faded and patched, moving like ghosts in the breeze. A vegetable garden stretched behind the cabin, though it looked sparse, the plants struggling in soil that needed more care than one person could give. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and hesitant, as if even the fire was rationed. Kangi dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud that seemed too loud in the stillness. He tied his horse to the fence post and stood for a moment studying the homestead with the practiced eye of someone who assessed everything as either threat or opportunity. The place was barely holding together. He could see that immediately. Boards needed replacing. The well looked like it hadn't been maintained properly, and the barn door hung crooked on rusted hinges. He pulled the deed from inside his coat, unfolding it with deliberate care. The paper crackled in the silence, official seals and signatures that meant everything in the white man's world, and nothing in the world that mattered. But it was the weapon he had, so he would use it. The cabin door opened before he reached it. Mariah Kern stepped out onto the porch, and Kangi felt his stride falter for just a fraction of a second. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe late 20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a loose braid that had come partially undone. Her dress was simple, faded blue calico that had been mended so many times the original pattern was hard to distinguish. But it was her eyes that caught him off guard. They were green, the color of new pine needles, and they held no fear, only exhaustion and something harder, something that recognized another survivor when she saw one. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe with the posture of someone who'd learned to make herself bigger than she was, to take up space in a world that wanted to push her into corners. Her face was thin, cheekbones prominent, but there was strength in the set of her jaw. This was not a woman who scared easily. Kangi stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, holding the deed where she could see it. He didn't bother with pleasantries. The time for that had passed long before he'd decided to reclaim what had been stolen. "This land belongs to me," he said, his voice carrying the accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language, but spoke it with precision. "I have the deed. Legal claim, signed by a territorial judge. You have until sundown to gather what you can carry and leave." Mariah's expression didn't change. She looked at the paper, then at him, then back at the paper. When she spoke, her voice was steady, though he could hear the exhaustion underneath it, like a current running beneath ice. "That's not possible," she said simply. "My husband homesteaded this land legally 6 years ago. We have our own deed, filed with the land office. Whatever paper you're holding is either a forgery or a mistake." Kangi's jaw tightened. He'd expected denial, expected pleading or tears or anger. What he hadn't expected was this calm certainty, this refusal to acknowledge what was plainly in front of her. "Your husband's claim was based on land that was never legally available for homesteading," Kangi replied, climbing the first step. "It was Apache territory, ceded under false pretenses in a treaty signed under duress. That treaty has been voided. The prior claim supersedes yours. The law is clear." Something flickered in Mariah's eyes, then a flash of anger that broke through the exhaustion. She pushed off from the doorframe and took a step forward, putting herself between Kangi and the entrance to her home. "The law," she said, and there was bitterness in her voice now, sharp as broken glass. "The law that took my husband in a work gang for taxes we couldn't pay, worked him until fever took him, and left me with nothing but debt and this piece of ground. The law that looks the other way when raiders come through taking what they want. That law. And now you stand here with another piece of paper telling me the law says I have to leave. Tell me, how many times can the law steal the same piece of ground?" Kangi felt something twist in his chest, an uncomfortable recognition. He pushed it down, buried it under the weight of his own grief and anger. This woman's suffering didn't erase his people's suffering. Her loss didn't make his people's loss any less devastating. "I'm not the government," he said coldly. "I'm not the cavalry or the Indian agent or the railroad company. I'm a man taking back what was stolen from my family. This ground, your ground, it's where my father hunted, where my mother gathered medicine plants, where my sister learned to track deer before she died, coughing up blood in a reservation sick house. So don't talk to me about what the law has taken from you. You have until sundown," He pushed past her, shouldering through the doorway with the deed still in his hand. Mariah stumbled back but didn't fall, her hand catching the doorframe. She followed him inside, her voice rising. "You can't just walk into my home. You can't just decide." "I can," Kangi cut her off, looking around the single room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space all at once. A table with mismatched chairs, a wood stove that had been repaired multiple times, shelves with sparse supplies, mostly empty jars, and a few sacks of flour and beans. A rocking chair in the corner with a blanket draped over it. Everything worn, everything used until it couldn't be used anymore, and then repaired and used again. The desperate economy of people living on the edge of nothing. "I have the law on my side," Kangi continued, turning to face her. "I have the deed. I have the judge's signature. What do you have? Stories? Sentiment? The graves of people who shouldn't have been here in the first place." That's when he saw them. Two boys emerged from behind a curtain that divided off a sleeping area. So thin they looked like they might blow away in a strong wind. The older one couldn't have been more than 8, the younger perhaps 5 or 6. They wore shirts that hung on their frames like fabric draped over fence posts, pants held up with rope because their waists had shrunk past where any belt could help. Their faces were gaunt, eyes too large in skulls covered with skin that looked stretched too tight. Their arms were stick-thin, every bone visible, every joint pronounced. They stood there, silent and staring, with the hollow-eyed look of children who'd learned that crying didn't bring food, and hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. Kangi froze. The deed in his hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Mariah moved to stand in front of her sons, her arms spreading slightly as if she could shield them from Kangi's gaze, from the reality of what he was seeing. Her voice when she spoke was quieter now, but no less fierce. "This is what I have," she said. "2 boys who need a home, who need this ground to survive. The garden that barely feeds us. The chickens that give us eggs when they can. The roof that keeps the rain off. Take it if you want. Use your law, your deed, your judge's signature. But know what you're taking. Know who you're putting out into nothing." The older boy looked at Kangi with eyes that held no accusation, no plea, just acceptance. The kind of acceptance that comes when you've already lost everything that matters, and you're just waiting to see what gets taken next. The younger one clung to his mother's skirt, his face buried against her hip, small shoulders shaking silently. Kangi stood in the center of that sparse room, surrounded by the evidence of desperate survival, facing 2 starving children and their mother, who stood between them and the world, like a wall made of nothing but will and love. And something inside him that he thought had died years ago began to crack. He'd come here to reclaim what was stolen, to strike back at a system that had destroyed everything he loved, to take by law what had been taken from his people by force. He'd come here with righteousness and rage and the absolute certainty that he was in the right. But standing there looking at those 2 boys, seeing his own sister's face in their hollow eyes, remembering his mother's desperate attempts to feed them on rations that never came, on promises that were broken before the ink dried, on hope that starved along with their bodies, Kangi felt the foundations of his certainty begin to shake. The deed trembled in his hand, not from fear, not from doubt, but from the sudden crushing weight of understanding that vengeance taken from the innocent looked exactly like the vengeance that had been taken from his own people. That stealing back what was stolen by stealing from someone who'd also been stolen from just made him another thief in a long line of thieves. That the cycle of taking and taking and taking never ended, never healed, never made anything right. It just kept spinning, grinding everyone down into the dust. Mariah watched him, her green eyes locked on his face, reading the conflict there with the instinct of someone who'd learned to read danger, to assess threats, to know when to run, and when to stand, and when to gamble everything on a moment of human connection that might not even exist. "Please," she said finally, and the word cost her something. Pride, maybe, dignity, the last fortress of self-respect that kept her standing when everything else said to fall. "We have nowhere to go. No family, no money. The town won't take us in. We owe too many debts. If you put us out, we'll die. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but we'll die. Those boys will die. Is that the justice you came here for? Is that what your father would want? Your mother? Your sister? The mention of his sister hit like a physical blow. Kangi's hand tightened on the deed, crinkling the paper. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Every instinct told him to walk out, to enforce the claim, to take what was his by right, and let the consequences fall where they may. The world hadn't shown him mercy. His people hadn't been shown mercy. Why should he extend it now? But he couldn't stop looking at those boys. The sun shifted, sending a beam of light through the window that illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. Outside, his horse whinnied softly. A chicken clucked somewhere behind the cabin. The wind breathed through the gaps in the walls, making the whole structure creak like an old man settling into a chair. Time stretched, measured in heartbeats and shallow breaths and the weight of impossible choices. Kangi looked down at the deed in his hand, at the official seals and signatures, at the words that gave him legal right to this ground, at the weapon he'd forged from the same system that had destroyed his people, at the tool he'd planned to use to strike back, to reclaim, to make someone, anyone, pay for what had been taken. Then he looked back at Mariah Kern, standing there with her sons behind her, ready to fight with nothing but her own body between them and the world, ready to go down swinging even though she had no chance of winning, just like his mother had stood. Just like his father had stood, signing that treaty knowing it was death, but hoping it might buy his children time. Just like his sister had stood against the sickness, fighting until her last breath, even though the medicine never came. The cycle had to break somewhere. How long? Kangi heard himself say, his voice rough as gravel. Since those boys had a real meal, Mariah's breath caught in her throat at the question. She hadn't expected it. Hadn't prepared for the shift in his tone from cold certainty to something that sounded almost human. Her arms tightened protectively around her sons as she studied Kangi's face, searching for the trap she was certain must be hidden in those words. 3 days, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. We had beans and a little cornmeal. Before that, nearly a week. The garden hasn't produced much this season. The drought hit us hard. The chickens stopped laying when we couldn't afford feed. I sold everything we didn't absolutely need just to buy flour. Kangi's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. He folded the deed carefully and tucked it back inside his coat, the gesture slow and deliberate. Then he turned toward the door without another word, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Mariah's heart plummeted. He was leaving. He was going to ride away and come back with the sheriff or a federal marshal, someone to enforce the eviction with authority and guns. She pulled her boys closer, feeling the sharp angles of their shoulder blades through their thin shirts, already calculating how far they could walk before nightfall, where they might find shelter, how long they could survive on nothing. But Kangi didn't mount his horse. Instead, he opened his saddlebag and began removing items with methodical precision. A cloth bundle that, when unwrapped, revealed dried venison strips, dark and preserved with salt. A smaller pouch of pemmican, the compressed mixture of fat and berries that could sustain a man for days. A sack of ground corn, properly prepared the old way. He carried everything back to the porch and set it down carefully, then returned to his horse for more. Smoked fish wrapped in oiled paper, wild onions and roots dug from the hills, a jar of rendered fat, dried prairie turnips that his people had harvested for generations. Mariah stood frozen in the doorway, her mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing with what she'd expected. The boys peeked around her skirts, their eyes fixed on the food with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. You'll cook this, Kangi said, not looking at her as he arranged the supplies on the porch boards. Feed your sons first, then yourself. I'll be back tomorrow morning. Why? The word burst from Mariah before she could stop it. Why are you doing this? You came here to take everything. You have the legal right. So why? Kangi finally met her eyes, and what she saw there made her words die in her throat. It wasn't kindness exactly, and it wasn't pity. It was something rawer, more complicated. Recognition, perhaps. The kind that comes from seeing your own suffering reflected in someone else's face. "Because I remember what hunger looks like," he said quietly. "And I remember what it does to children, how it hollows them out from the inside until there's nothing left but bones and ghosts. I won't be the reason those boys die. Not today." He moved past her again, this time examining the cabin's structure with a different eye. Not as someone calculating what he'd won, but as someone assessing what needed to be fixed. He tested the doorframe, finding it loose, checked the window seals and found gaps where the wind pushed through, stepped outside to examine the roof and the way water had damaged the northwest corner. "Your husband built this?" he asked. "Yes," Mariah said, following him outside while keeping the boys close. "Thomas. He wasn't a carpenter by trade. He learned as he went. It kept us dry and warm enough, but there's always something that needs mending," Kangi grunted, circling the cabin slowly. "The foundation is settling unevenly on the north side. That's why the door doesn't hang right. The chimney needs repointing before winter, or you'll have smoke problems. And that barn won't survive the first heavy snow unless the frame gets reinforced." Mariah's confusion deepened into something close to anger. "Why does any of that matter to you? You're taking the land. What do you care if the buildings fall apart?" "I said I'd be back tomorrow morning," Kangi replied, moving to inspect the well. He peered down into the darkness, then dropped a stone and listened for the splash. "That means you'll still be here tomorrow morning, and the morning after that. We'll discuss the rest later. Right now, your boys need to eat, and you need to figure out how to make that food last." He returned to his horse and swung into the saddle with the easy grace of someone who'd been riding since before he could walk. Mariah watched him, her mind reeling, trying to understand the shift that had occurred, the crack in the armor of certainty he'd worn when he first arrived. "I don't understand you," she said. Kangi looked down at her from his horse, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. "Good," he said simply. "I don't understand myself right now. But those boys will eat tonight, and that's enough understanding for one day." He turned the paint stallion and rode away, leaving Mariah standing in the yard with her arms around her sons, and more questions than answers swirling in her mind like the dust kicked up by his horse's hooves. The older boy, whose name was Samuel, tugged at his mother's dress. "Mama, is he coming back to make us leave?" Mariah looked down at her son's upturned face, at the hope and fear mixed there in equal measure, and realized she had no idea how to answer that question. "I don't know, Samuel," she said honestly, "but right now, we're going to cook that venison and you and your brother are going to eat until your bellies are full. Whatever tomorrow brings, we'll face it with strength. Come on." She gathered the food Kangi had left and brought it inside, her hands trembling slightly as she unwrapped the dried meat. It had been so long since they'd had protein, since the boys had eaten anything more substantial than thin gruel and whatever vegetables she could coax from the struggling garden. She built up the fire in the stove, using precious wood because for once, for this one meal, she didn't have to ration everything down to the last splinter. The younger boy, Daniel, watched everything with wide eyes. "Is the Indian man going to hurt us?" "He's Apache," Mariah corrected gently, cutting the venison into pieces that would cook faster. "And no, I don't think he's going to hurt us. I think he might be just as confused as we are." Samuel climbed onto a chair, his thin legs dangling. "Papa used to say Indians were dangerous, that they'd scalp us if they got the chance." Mariah paused in her work, choosing her words carefully. "Your papa said a lot of things he heard from other people, things he didn't know for certain were true. The man who was just here, Kangi, he had every right by law to throw us out today. He could have brought men with guns. He could have burned the cabin and not cared what happened to us. But instead he brought food. He gave us enough to last a week, maybe more if we're careful. That doesn't sound like someone who wants to hurt us." "But he still wants the land," Samuel said, with the blunt logic of children who see through adult complications. "Yes," Mariah admitted, dropping the meat into the heated pan where it began to sizzle. The smell made her stomach clench with hunger so intense it was almost painful. He still wants the land, and I don't know what happens next. But tonight, we eat. Tonight, you boys get to sleep with full bellies. And tomorrow, we'll see what tomorrow brings. They ate slowly, Mariah forcing herself to pace the meal, even though every instinct screamed to devour everything at once. She knew from hard experience that eating too much too fast after prolonged hunger could make you sick. She gave the boys small portions first, waited, then gave them more. She watched their faces transform as strength returned, color coming back into their pale cheeks, their eyes becoming brighter and more alert. After dinner, after the boys had been washed and tucked into their narrow bed behind the curtain, Mariah sat alone in the rocking chair and stared at the remaining food wrapped carefully on the table. Her mind kept returning to the moment when Kangi had frozen, when he'd seen her sons, and something in his face had shattered. She'd learned to read men during her marriage and in the hard years after Thomas died. She'd learned to see the difference between real emotion and performed emotion, between genuine reaction and calculated manipulation. What she'd seen in Kangi's eyes had been real. The question was, what did it mean? And could she trust it? Or was this some longer game she didn't yet understand, some way of lowering her defenses before he struck the final blow? She'd been fooled before by kindness that turned out to have conditions attached. The world had taught her that nothing came free, that every gift had strings, that survival meant staying suspicious even when you wanted desperately to believe in simple human decency. But those boys had eaten tonight. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever Kangi's true intentions were, her sons had food in their bellies. In the arithmetic of maternal desperation, that counted for something, maybe everything. She fell asleep in the chair, too exhausted to make it to her own narrow bed, and dreamed of her husband Thomas. He'd been a good man, gentle and hard-working, but the frontier had broken him slowly. The taxes they couldn't pay, the crop failures, the sickness that took him while he was working off their debt on a government road crew, treated like a convict for the crime of being poor. She'd loved him, but she'd also resented him for dying and leaving her alone with 2 babies and a homestead she had no idea how to maintain. In her dream, Thomas stood at the edge of the property, his back to her, looking out at the land they'd tried so hard to tame. When he turned, his face was Kangi's face, and she woke with a gasp as the first light of dawn crept through the window. True to his word, Kangi returned as the sun climbed above the horizon. This time he brought tools, a leather satchel filled with implements that looked well used and carefully maintained. He dismounted and tied his horse, then stood in the yard waiting until Mariah emerged from the cabin. She'd done her best to make herself presentable, braiding her hair more carefully, washing her face and hands, putting on her least-patched dress. She didn't know why it mattered, but somehow it did. Samuel and Daniel hovered in the doorway behind her, no longer skeletal after one good meal, but still thin, still wary. "I'm going to repair your door," Kangi said without preamble. "Then I'll fix the window seals before the weather turns cold. After that, the barn. Why?" Mariah asked again, the same question as yesterday, but with different weight behind it. Kangi set down his tools and looked at her directly. In the morning light, she could see details she'd missed before. The scar that ran down his face, silvered with age. The grey threading through his black hair, despite him being probably no older than 35. The way he held himself with absolute control, every movement economical, nothing wasted. He was a man who'd learned to survive in a world that wanted him dead. "Because I made a choice yesterday," he said. "When I saw your sons, I made a choice not to be the thing I hate. Not to become another person who takes from the desperate and calls it justice. But that doesn't mean the land isn't mine by right. It doesn't mean the wrong done to my people is erased. So we're going to find another way." "What way?" Mariah's voice was sharper than she intended. "You can't have it both ways. Either you take the land or you don't. Either we stay or we go." "You'll stay," Kangi said. "You'll work the land, maintain the buildings, raise your sons here. And I'll teach you how to do it properly. how to read the seasons and the soil the way my people did for generations before yours arrived. In exchange, when the harvest comes, when the cattle are sold, when there's profit from this ground, it'll be split. Half to you and your sons. Half to me." Mariah stared at him, trying to process what he was proposing. "You want to be partners? Share ownership." "No, I want what's mine by right," Kangi corrected. "But I won't take it by destroying what little you have. Your husband worked this land, paid for it with his life, whether he knew it or not. Your sons were born here. Their sweat is in this soil, even if they're too young to know it. So yes, partners. But understand this clearly, I won't be cheated. I won't be lied to. And if you try to push me out or claim the whole thing for yourself, I'll enforce the deed and you'll have nothing. Are we clear?" Mariah's mind raced through the implications. It wasn't ideal, splitting ownership with a man she'd met yesterday, a man who'd come to evict her and changed his mind for reasons she still didn't fully understand. But it was survival. It was her boys having a home and food and a future. It was better than anything she could have hoped for 24 hours ago. "We're clear," she said. "But I have conditions too. You don't come into the cabin uninvited. You don't give orders to my sons without my permission. And if this arrangement doesn't work, if we can't make it function, you give us notice. Time to find somewhere else to go. You don't just throw us out in the cold." Something that might have been respect flickered in Kangi's eyes. "Agreed," he said. He held out his hand, the gesture oddly formal given the circumstances. Mariah looked at his extended hand for a long moment. It was scarred and calloused, the hand of someone who'd worked and fought and survived against impossible odds. Not so different from her own hands, really. She reached out and clasped it, feeling the strength in his grip, the weight of the bargain they were making. "Then let's get to work," she said. Kangi nodded and picked up his tools. He moved to the door and began examining the frame more closely, identifying where the wood had swollen and warped, where the hinges needed adjustment. Samuel crept closer, fascinated despite his earlier fear, watching the Apache warrior work with tools that seemed like extensions of his hands. "Can I help?" the boy asked tentatively. Kangi glanced at him, then at Mariah, who gave a small nod of permission. "You can hold the nails," he said, "but don't drop them. Iron is valuable out here. We can't waste it." Samuel's face lit up with the first genuine smile Mariah had seen in months. He positioned himself carefully next to Kangi, his small hand extended to receive the nails, his entire being focused on doing the job right. Mariah watched them work together, the warrior and the boy, and felt something shift in her chest. Not trust, not yet. Trust had to be earned over time, but maybe the beginning of trust. Maybe the first small seed of it taking root in soil that had been too hard and dry to grow anything for far too long. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel tugged at her skirt. "Mama, I'm hungry again." She looked down at her younger son and felt tears prick at her eyes. Such simple words, such ordinary words. The kind of words that should be normal, but hadn't been for so long. "Then let's make breakfast," she said. "A real breakfast with meat and fried cornmeal." "What do you say?" The boy's eyes went wide. "Really? Really?" Mariah confirmed, leading him back inside. As she cooked, she could hear the steady rhythm of Kangi's hammer, the low murmur of his voice as he explained something to Samuel, the creak of wood being adjusted and fitted properly. Outside her window, the land stretched away toward the hills. The same land that had been fought over and died for and stolen and reclaimed so many times that the earth itself probably didn't know who it belonged to anymore. Maybe that was the point, she thought, turning the sizzling meat. Maybe the land didn't belong to anyone. Maybe people only ever borrowed it for a while, worked it for a season or a lifetime, and then passed on, leaving nothing but stories and the marks of their labor. Maybe the only thing that really mattered was whether you used your time on the earth to create or destroy, to build up or tear down, to feed hungry children or let them starve. Kangi had made his choice yesterday when he saw her sons. And she was making hers now, accepting his help, even though it came wrapped in complications and uncertain futures. They were both choosing creation over destruction, building over breaking, whatever fragile partnership they could forge over the ashes of everything that had been taken from them both. It wasn't much, but it was something, and something was infinitely better than nothing. The door swung open smoothly on its repaired hinges, and Samuel burst in with excitement written all over his thin face. "Mama, I helped fix it. Mr. Kangi showed me how to set the pins right and everything." Mariah looked at her son, then at Kangi standing in the doorway, and allowed herself the smallest smile. "Did you thank him?" Samuel turned immediately. "Thank you, Mr. Kangi." The warrior nodded once, his expression still guarded but not quite as cold as before. "You did good work. Tomorrow we'll start on the barn." And just like that, tomorrow became a certainty instead of a threat. Just like that, they had a future that extended beyond one meal, one day, one desperate prayer for survival. Just like that, the impossible partnership began to take shape, built on hunger and memory and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the cycle of taking could be broken by two people choosing to give instead. 3 weeks passed, like water finding its course through stone, carving out channels that hadn't existed before. The rhythm of the homestead changed, shaped by Kangi's presence and his relentless focus on making everything function properly. He arrived each morning before the sun cleared the horizon and worked until the light failed. His hands never still, his mind always calculating the next repair, the next improvement, the next problem that needed solving. The barn was his first major project. Mariah watched from the cabin window as he dismantled the sagging frame, piece by piece, examining each board for rot and weakness, salvaging what could be saved and marking what needed replacing. He disappeared into the hills for 2 days and returned with a travois, loaded with timber he'd cut and stripped himself. Lodgepole pine that would hold against the winter winds better than the cottonwood Thomas had originally used. Samuel became his constant shadow during these projects, the boy's curiosity overcoming his initial wariness. Kangi didn't coddle him or speak down to him the way most adults did with children. Instead, he explained things with the same serious tone he might use with another man, showing Samuel how to read the grain of wood to know where it would split, how to measure twice and cut once, how to drive a nail so it held without bending. "Why do you check every board like that?" Samuel asked one afternoon, watching Kangi examine a piece of timber with meticulous attention. "Because one weak board in the wrong place brings down the whole structure," Kangi replied, running his hand along the wood surface. "You don't see the weakness until the weight comes down on it. By then it's too late. So you look before you build, and you only use what's strong." The boy nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson that was about more than carpentry. Mariah, shucking corn on the porch, recognized the teaching for what it was. Kangi was passing down knowledge the way his own father probably had. The way generations of Apache men had taught their sons to survive in a world that gave nothing freely. Daniel was younger and less interested in the building work, but he'd developed his own connection with Kangi through the horses. The paint stallion that Kangi rode had a temperament as controlled as its owner, but Daniel seemed to sense something gentler underneath. He'd started bringing the horse apples from their meager supply, speaking to it in whispers. And one morning, Kangi had lifted the small boy onto the horse's back and walked them around the corral. Mariah's heart had caught in her throat, watching her youngest son sitting so high up, but Daniel's face had been radiant with joy. When Kangi lifted him down, the boy had thrown his thin arms around the warrior's leg in spontaneous gratitude. Kangi had frozen for just a moment, clearly unprepared for the gesture, before awkwardly patting Daniel's shoulder. It was the most human she'd seen him look. The work wasn't just physical repairs. Kangi taught Mariah things about the land itself that Thomas had never known, knowledge passed down through generations of people who'd lived here when the buffalo still darkened the plains. He showed her which wild plants were edible and how to prepare them, which ones had medicinal properties, how to read animal tracks, and know what had passed through during the night. He taught her to look at the color of the soil and know what it needed, to watch the behavior of birds and predict weather changes, to understand the language of the earth that most settlers ignored in their rush to impose their own will on it. "Your husband tried to farm this like it was Ohio or Pennsylvania," Kangi said one morning, crouching in the garden plot. "But this isn't that land. The water is different, the seasons are different, the soil needs different handling. You can't force what works somewhere else to work here. You have to listen to what the land tells you. And what's it telling you?" Mariah asked, genuinely curious. Kangi dug his fingers into the earth, lifting a handful and letting it fall through his fingers. "It's telling me it's tired. Your husband took from it without giving back, planted the same crops in the same places until the soil had nothing left to give. You need to rotate, let sections rest, work in manure and compost. The Apache way was to move with the seasons, take what the land offered when it was ready to give. You can't move, you're stuck here, so you have to find another way to work with the cycles instead of against them." Over the following days, he helped her redesign the entire garden plot, sectioning it differently, explaining what should be planted where and when. He brought seeds he'd collected from native plants that were better suited to the climate, showed her how to build raised beds that would drain properly during the occasional heavy rains and retain moisture during the long, dry spells. "This will take years to restore properly," he warned. "You won't see full results in one season, but each year will be better than the last if you work with the land instead of trying to dominate it." Mariah found herself learning things she'd never imagined needing to know, skills that Thomas had either not possessed or had been too proud to seek from the original inhabitants of this territory. There was something both humbling and empowering about it, this knowledge that came from hundreds of years of observation and adaptation. She'd grown up being told that Indians were savages who knew nothing of civilization. But working alongside Kangi was teaching her that civilization meant something very different depending on who was defining it. The evening meals became a tentative gathering point. At first, Kangi had refused to come inside when Mariah invited him to eat with them, taking his portion outside to eat alone. But Samuel had started bringing him questions that couldn't wait until morning. And Daniel had simply walked out one night and climbed into his lap, with the unself-conscious trust of very young children. And gradually, the warrior had found himself sitting at their rough table more often than not. The conversations during these meals were stilted at first, full of long silences and careful words. But slowly, incrementally, they began to share pieces of their stories. Mariah talked about Thomas, about their journey west, full of hope and ignorance, about the slow, grinding poverty that had killed him as surely as any bullet. Kangi spoke sparingly of his own past, but the fragments he offered painted a picture of loss that made Mariah's hardship seem almost merciful by comparison. "My father believed the treaties," Kangi said one night, his voice distant. "He thought if we gave up the land peacefully, if we moved to the reservation as they asked, they would keep their promises. Food supplies protection. He signed the papers because he thought it would save us. What happened?" Mariah asked quietly. "They lied," Kangi said simply. "The food never came, or it came spoiled, or in quantities too small to feed everyone. The supplies were sold by corrupt agents before they reached us. The protection meant nothing when ranchers wanted our remaining land, and the army looked the other way. My father died believing he'd failed us. My mother vanished into the system. My sister coughed herself to death in a reservation hospital that had no medicine and didn't care." Samuel, listening intently, spoke up. "Is that why you wanted our land? Because it was yours first?" Kangi looked at the boy, and Mariah saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not anger or bitterness, but something closer to respect for the directness of the question. "Yes," he said. "This ground where your cabin stands, this was part of our hunting territory. My grandfather killed his first elk within sight of where your barn is now. My grandmother gathered healing plants from the creek that runs through your back section. When I found the deed that said it was mine by prior claim, I thought I was reclaiming something stolen. But then I came here and saw you and your sons, and I realized that you'd been stolen from too. Different theft, same result. So what now?" Samuel pressed. "Are you still mad at us for being here?" The question hung in the air while Kangi considered it. Outside, the night insects sang their endless songs, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. Finally, he shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I'm not mad at you. You didn't steal this land. You were given it by people who had no right to give it. That's not your fault. But it's also not my fault that it was stolen from my people. So we find a way forward that doesn't require more stealing, more taking, more dying. We build something different. Is that possible?" Mariah asked, and she wasn't entirely sure whether she was asking about the land or about something larger. "We're doing it right now," Kangi replied. "Whether it lasts, whether it works, that's what we'll find out." Daniel, who'd been falling asleep at the table, suddenly perked up. "Are you going to live here with us?" The question caught everyone off guard. Mariah felt her cheeks flush slightly, though she couldn't articulate exactly why. Kangi's expression became carefully neutral, and she recognized it as his defensive posture, the mask he wore when emotions threatened to surface. "I have a camp in the hills," he said. "That's where I live, but you're here all the time," Daniel persisted with the logic of a 6-year-old. "And Mama makes enough food for you now, and Samuel says you're teaching him to build things. So why don't you just stay?" "Daniel, that's enough," Mariah said gently. "Mr. Kangi has his own life. We can't expect him to—" "I'll think about it," Kangi interrupted, and both Mariah and Daniel looked at him in surprise. "Winter's coming. It would be more efficient to be here rather than riding back and forth in the snow, but I'd need to build my own space. I won't crowd you in the cabin." Mariah's mind raced through the implications. Having Kangi living on the property full-time would certainly make the work easier, the protection better. But it also represented a level of commitment that made her nervous, a blurring of boundaries between business partnership and something more complicated. Still, he was right about the efficiency, and they had so much work to do before the hard weather arrived. "There's room on the east side of the barn," she heard herself say. "Good drainage, some shelter from the wind. You could build something there." Kangi nodded slowly. "I'll start tomorrow." True to his word, he began the next morning, marking out a space for a small structure that would serve as his quarters. It wouldn't be large, just enough room for a bed, a stove, storage for his possessions. Samuel helped him dig the foundation posts, learning the importance of depth and stability, while Mariah and Daniel worked on preserving the late-season vegetables from the garden. As she worked, Mariah found herself watching Kangi more than she probably should. There was something almost meditative about the way he approached every task, the complete focus he brought to each action. No movement was wasted, no step unnecessary. He worked the way a river flowed, finding the most efficient path and following it with inexorable patience. She'd noticed other things too, details she told herself were meaningless but couldn't quite dismiss. The way he always made sure the boys ate before he did. How he'd started leaving small gifts, never mentioned or acknowledged. A perfectly carved whistle for Samuel, a smooth stone with fossil impressions for Daniel, a bundle of wild sage for Mariah that made the cabin smell clean and fresh. The way his expression softened almost imperceptibly when Daniel climbed on him, or Samuel asked him questions. He was letting them in, she realized. Slowly, carefully, like a wild animal learning to trust that the hand offering food wouldn't suddenly strike. He was building more than just a shelter or a barn. He was building connections, allowing himself to be part of something after years of being alone. The thought should have pleased her. Instead, it filled her with a complicated mixture of emotions she didn't want to examine too closely. Relief that the partnership was working, gratitude for everything he'd done for them, but also something else, something that felt dangerous in its intensity. She was starting to depend on him, not just for the physical labor and knowledge, but for the sense of security his presence brought. The feeling that they weren't alone anymore, that someone strong and capable was invested in their survival. It was a feeling that scared her because she'd felt it before with Thomas. And Thomas had died and left her with nothing but grief and debt and 2 small boys she had no idea how to raise alone. One afternoon, while Kangi was working on the roof of his new structure and the boys were playing near the creek under strict instructions not to go in the water, Mariah found herself standing in the yard, watching him work. He'd removed his shirt in the heat, his back marked with scars that told stories of violence and survival. She saw the evidence of knife wounds, burns, the puckered mark of what might have been a bullet that went clean through. He'd survived things that would have killed most men. He'd lost everything and kept going. He'd hardened himself into something almost inhuman in his control and discipline. But he was also the man who'd brought food for starving children, who taught her son carpentry with patient attention, who'd looked at her desperate situation and chosen mercy over vengeance. "You're staring," Kangi said without turning around. And Mariah, startled, embarrassed to be caught. "I was just thinking," she said, scrambling for something to say that wasn't completely revealing, "about how much you've done here in such a short time. Thomas and I worked this place for years and barely kept it standing. You've accomplished more in 3 weeks than we managed in 3 years. Kangi climbed down from the roof and picked up his shirt, pulling it on with economical movements. "Your husband was working against the land," he said. "I'm working with it. That makes the difference. Also, he was trying to do it alone. You can't survive alone out here, no matter how strong you think you are. You need help. Everyone needs help. Is that what you are?" Mariah asked before she could stop herself. "Help or something more?" Kangi looked at her directly, his dark eyes unreadable. "What do you want me to be?" "As in—" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address. Mariah felt her heart beating faster, felt the weight of choices pressing down on her. She could deflect, keep things simple and clear, maintain the careful boundaries of their business arrangement. Or she could be honest, step into the complicated truth of what was developing between them. Before she could answer, Samuel's voice rang out from the direction of the creek. "Mama, come quick!" Daniel fell in. Mariah's heart seized with panic, and she was running before conscious thought caught up, Kangi already ahead of her, moving with the speed of a predator responding to threat. They reached the creek bank to find Daniel standing in knee-deep water, completely soaked but unharmed, looking more surprised than scared. Samuel was pale, clearly having expected worse. Kangi waded in and scooped Daniel up, carrying him to the bank where Mariah took him with shaking hands. "Are you hurt?" she demanded, checking him over with frantic attention. "No, Mama," Daniel said, his teeth starting to chatter as the autumn wind hit his wet clothes. "I just slipped on the rocks. Samuel grabbed my hand, or I might have gone under." Mariah pulled Samuel close with her free arm, her heart still racing with the adrenaline of fear. "You did good," she told her older son. "You did exactly right." Kangi stood dripping in the creek, and something in his posture made Mariah look at him more closely. His face had gone completely blank, that mask of control she'd learned to recognize as his response to strong emotion. His hands were clenched at his sides, and she realized he was trembling slightly. "Kangi," she said. He turned away abruptly, wading out of the creek and walking toward his unfinished structure without a word. Mariah hesitated, torn between getting Daniel into dry clothes and following the warrior who'd suddenly shut down completely. "Take Daniel inside," Samuel said quietly, with the surprising wisdom children sometimes displayed. "I think Mr. Kangi needs to be alone right now." Mariah nodded and carried Daniel back to the cabin, stripping off his wet clothes and wrapping him in a blanket near the stove. But her mind was on Kangi, on the way he'd reacted to the near accident with an intensity that went beyond normal concern. Later, after Daniel was warm and dry and playing with the fossil stone Kangi had given him, Mariah walked to the new structure. She found Kangi sitting on the half-finished floor, his back against the wall, staring at nothing. "My sister drowned," he said before Mariah could speak. "She was 7 years old. We were at the river. She slipped on the rocks just like your boy did." But I couldn't reach her in time. The current took her and I couldn't save her. I watched her go under and I couldn't do anything. Mariah felt her throat tighten with shared grief. She moved slowly, carefully, and sat down beside him on the rough boards. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing the words were inadequate but having nothing better to offer. "I thought I was past it," Kangi said, his voice rough. "I thought I'd put all that behind me, locked it away where it couldn't touch me anymore. But seeing Daniel in that water, seeing him slip, it all came back like it happened yesterday. The fear, the helplessness, the knowledge that you failed to protect someone who trusted you." "You didn't fail your sister," Mariah said firmly. "You were a child. Children can't always save other children. That's not your fault. Tell that to the part of me that still hears her screaming my name," Kangi said. They sat in silence for a long time, shoulders not quite touching, but close enough to feel each other's warmth in the cooling evening air. Finally, Mariah spoke quietly. "When Thomas died, I was so angry at him. Not for getting sick, you can't control that. But for being reckless, for working himself so hard, trying to pay off debts that I told him we should just walk away from. For choosing his pride over his health, over me, over the boys who needed their father. I know it's not fair to be angry at a dead man, but I am. I'm furious at him for leaving us alone." Kangi turned to look at her, and she met his eyes steadily. "We're all carrying ghosts," she continued. "All carrying the weight of people we couldn't save, choices we can't undo, losses that carved holes in us that never quite fill back in. But we're still here, still breathing, still trying, still finding reasons to keep going. Your sister wouldn't want you to stop living because she died, just like Thomas wouldn't want me to give up on the boys. The dead don't need our guilt. They need us to survive, to keep going, to make something worthwhile out of the life they don't have anymore." Kangi's jaw worked silently for a moment, and Mariah thought she saw moisture in his eyes before he blinked it away. "You're stronger than you know," he said finally. "So are you," Mariah replied. "Strong enough to save Daniel today. Strong enough to help us survive when you could have destroyed us. Strong enough to build something new instead of just breaking what's already broken." Kangi nodded slowly, and some of the tension in his shoulders eased. They sat together as the sun sank toward the horizon, two people carrying impossible weights, finding in each other's company a momentary lightness, a shared understanding that made the burden just slightly more bearable. Tomorrow they would return to work. Tomorrow there would be more building, more planting, more preparation for the winter that was coming. But tonight, in the fading light, they simply sat together in the partial shelter Kangi was building, surrounded by the evidence of what they were creating together, and let themselves rest. Winter announced itself with a cold snap that turned the morning dew to frost and painted the grass silver. Kangi had finished his quarters just in time, a compact but sturdy structure built with the same meticulous attention he brought to everything. Inside it was sparse, almost monastic, a bedroll, a small stove, hooks for his weapons and tools, and little else. He'd carved symbols into one of the support beams, markings Mariah didn't recognize, but didn't ask about. Some things were meant to remain private. The harvest had been modest, but better than anything Mariah had managed in previous years. Following Kangi's guidance, they'd stored vegetables in the root cellar he'd helped her dig deeper and line with stones for better insulation. Dried corn hung in bundles from the rafters. Smoked meat wrapped in cloth occupied one corner. It wasn't abundance, but it was enough to see them through until spring if they were careful. The real challenge came with the first heavy snow. It arrived suddenly, a blizzard that turned the world white and howling within hours. Mariah woke to find drifts piled against the cabin door, and the temperature dropping so fast she could see her breath inside, despite the fire burning in the stove. Kangi appeared before she'd even finished stoking the fire, snow-covered and carrying an armload of wood. "The barn," he said without preamble. "We need to check the animals and make sure the roof is holding. This storm is going to last 2, maybe 3 days." They bundled the boys in every piece of warm clothing they owned and made the trek to the barn as a family, fighting through knee-deep snow that Daniel could barely manage. Kangi ended up carrying the younger boy on his shoulders while Samuel clung to his mother's hand. all of them leaning into the wind that tried to push them back toward the cabin. Inside the barn, the 3 horses they'd acquired, 2 from trade and 1 wild Mustang Kangi, had broken himself, stood in their stalls looking anxious but unharmed. The chickens huddled together in their coop, and the 2 milk cows Kangi had somehow obtained shifted nervously at the storm's violence. He'd been right about reinforcing the structure. The barn stood solid against the wind, the new beams holding firm where the old would have buckled. "We'll need to bring extra feed out twice a day," Kangi said, checking the hay supply. "The cold burns through their energy faster, and we should probably move the chickens into the cabin until this passes." "They won't survive this temperature," Mariah nodded, already mentally rearranging the cramped space to accommodate a coop. It would be chaotic and smell like chickens, but it was better than losing their egg supply. They worked together, Kangi building a temporary pen while Mariah and Samuel transferred the protesting birds one by one. Daniel tried to help, but mostly got in the way, which Kangi tolerated with more patience than Mariah would have expected. By the time they finished, they were all shivering despite the work. Back in the cabin, Mariah made coffee while Kangi added more wood to the fire. The boys pressed close to the stove, their faces red from cold. And for the first time, Mariah realized how small the cabin felt, with all of them inside together. "You should stay here," she said to Kangi. "Your structure is good, but it's not insulated like this cabin. In this cold, you'll burn through all your fuel just staying alive." Kangi looked uncomfortable with the suggestion. "I'll manage," he said. "Don't be stupid," Mariah replied bluntly. "There's no point in both structures burning wood when one will do. We've got the boys' room behind the curtain, and you can sleep out here by the fire. It's practical, nothing more." She saw him weighing it, pride against practicality, his need for independence against the simple truth that she was right. Finally he nodded once. "Until the storm passes," he said. Those 3 days trapped inside together by the blizzard changed something fundamental in their arrangement. Confined to close quarters with nothing to do but talk and wait out the weather, the careful boundaries they'd maintained began to blur. Kangi told stories about his childhood, about learning to hunt with his father, about the old ways of his people before everything fell apart. Samuel listened with rapt attention, absorbing every word, while Daniel dozed in his mother's lap. Mariah shared her own stories in return about growing up in Missouri, about her mother, who died when she was young, about meeting Thomas at a church social and believing he'd give her a better life than the one she'd known, about the journey west that had been full of hope and ignorance in equal measure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "Did you love him?" Kangi asked one evening, the question surprising in its directness. Mariah considered it carefully. "I thought I did when we married," she said slowly. "But I was 17 and didn't know what love really was. I cared for him, respected him, built a life with him. But there was always this distance between us, like we were partners in survival more than true companions." "Does that make sense?" "Not yet," Kangi said quietly. "I was married once, an arranged match the old way. She was a good woman, strong and skilled. We would have had a good life together. But she died in the massacre when the cavalry came through. We'd been married 3 months. I barely knew her. The revelation hung in the air between them." Samuel had fallen asleep leaning against Kangi's side, and Mariah noticed how naturally the warrior's arm had settled around the boy's shoulders. Daniel was sprawled on her own lap, his breathing deep and even. Outside, the wind howled like something alive and angry, but inside the small cabin, there was warmth and unexpected comfort. "We're both broken people," Mariah said softly, "carrying losses that never quite heal, trying to build something solid on foundations that were shattered." "Maybe that's what makes it work," Kangi replied. "We both know what it costs to survive. We don't have illusions about how hard life is. We're not pretending the world is anything other than what it is." "And what is it?" Mariah asked. "Brutal," Kangi said without hesitation. "Unforgiving, full of people who take what they want and justify it however they need to, but also sometimes full of moments like this. Warm cabin, full bellies, children sleeping safely. Small victories carved out of all that brutality. Worth fighting for, maybe. On the second night of the storm, Daniel woke screaming from a nightmare. Mariah rushed to comfort him, but the boy was inconsolable, crying for his father, asking why Papa had to die and leave them alone. Samuel woke too, looking frightened by his brother's distress. Kangi rose from his bedroll by the fire and moved with surprising gentleness to where Mariah held the sobbing child. "May I?" he asked, and when she nodded, he carefully took Daniel from her arms. "I understand," he said to the boy, his deep voice surprisingly soothing. "You miss your father. That pain doesn't go away. It stays with you like a scar you carry forever. But scars mean you survived something that could have killed you. They're proof you're strong enough to keep living even when it hurts." Daniel hiccuped, his small hands clutching Kangi's shirt. "But I want him back," he whispered. "I know," Kangi said. "I want my sister back. I want my mother and father back. I want everyone I've lost to still be alive. But they're not, and wishing doesn't change that. What we can do is honor them by living well, by being strong, by taking care of the people who are still here. Your father would want you to be brave. Can you be brave?" Daniel nodded slowly against Kangi's chest, his crying gradually subsiding into shuddering breaths. Kangi held him until the boy fell back asleep, then carefully transferred him to his bed. When he turned back, he found Mariah watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You're good with them," she said quietly. "I remember being a child," Kangi replied. "Remember what it felt like to be scared and small in a world that seemed designed to hurt you. If I can make it less frightening for them, even a little, then maybe some good comes from all the bad." Mariah stood and moved closer, close enough that he could see the firelight reflected in her green eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for not destroying us when you could have, for building instead of breaking, for being here." Kangi looked down at her, aware of how close she was standing, aware of the warmth radiating from her in the cold cabin, aware that something was shifting between them that went beyond partnership or shared survival. "I should be thanking you," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "You gave me a reason to be something other than angry, a purpose beyond revenge. I didn't realize how much I needed that until I found it here." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities and dangerous hope. Then Mariah stepped back, breaking the spell, wrapping her arms around herself. "We should sleep," she said. "Morning will come whether we're ready or not." Kangi nodded and returned to his bedroll, but sleep was slow in coming. He lay awake listening to the storm and the quiet breathing of the family around him and wondered what he was building here. It had started as reclamation, taking back what was stolen. But it had become something else entirely, something he didn't have words for but felt growing stronger every day. When the storm finally broke on the fourth morning, the world outside was transformed into a landscape of pristine white that sparkled in the sunlight like diamonds scattered across the earth. The work of digging out and checking on everything was exhausting, but they did it together, Samuel helping Kangi shovel paths while Mariah and Daniel fed the animals and gathered eggs. That afternoon, riders appeared on the horizon. 3 men on horseback, moving slowly through the snow. Kangi tensed immediately, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle leaning against the barn wall. Mariah saw his posture shift and felt her own anxiety spike. "Who are they?" Samuel asked, picking up on the sudden tension. "I don't know," Kangi said. "But stay behind me." The riders approached slowly, hands visible and away from weapons, which was either a good sign or a calculated deception. As they got closer, Mariah recognized one of them, a rancher named Cullen, who owned property about 10 miles east. The other 2 wore badges, deputy marshals by the look of them. They stopped at the edge of the property, and Cullen called out, "Mrs. Kern, we need to speak with you. It's official business." Mariah stepped forward, Kangi a solid presence at her side. "What kind of business?" She called back. One of the deputies urged his horse closer. He was older, with a graying beard and tired eyes that had seen too much frontier justice. Ma'am, we've received complaints about your situation here. Reports of an Indian living on your property, possibly holding you against your will. We're here to investigate and ensure your safety." Mariah felt anger flash hot in her chest. She knew exactly where this was coming from, knew that the few neighbors they had would see Kangi's presence as something threatening rather than what it actually was. "I'm perfectly safe," she said firmly. "Kangi is my business partner. He has legal claim to this land, and we've reached an agreement. There's no crime here." "With respect, ma'am," the deputy said, his tone suggesting he didn't believe her, "we need to verify that. And we need to see this legal claim Mr. Cullen here says doesn't exist." Kangi moved forward, his posture radiating controlled danger. "The deed is filed with the Territorial Land Office, signed by Judge Morrison. Everything is legal and proper. If you doubt it, ride to town and check the records." The deputy's hand moved slightly toward his gun, and suddenly the air was electric with potential violence. Mariah's heart hammered in her chest as she realized how quickly this could turn deadly. "Kangi has done nothing wrong," she said loudly, putting herself between him and the deputies. "He's helped us survive, repaired our buildings, taught us to work the land properly, provided food when we were starving. If you arrest him or drive him off, you're condemning me and my sons to death. Is that what you want? To murder 2 children through bureaucracy?" When the deputy hesitated, clearly not expecting such fierce resistance, Cullen spoke up, his voice carrying an ugly undertone. "Margaret, the man's an Indian. You can't trust them. They're violent by nature, unpredictable. He's probably just waiting for the right moment to—" "To what?" Mariah snapped. "To fix our barn? To teach my son carpentry? To save my younger boy from drowning? To sit up nights, making sure we have enough firewood to survive the winter? If that's what violence looks like, then I'll take it over your brand of neighborly concern that showed up exactly never when we were actually struggling." Samuel stepped forward then, his young voice clear and strong. "Mr. Kangi is good," he said. "He's teaching me things my pa never knew. He's nice to us, and he works hard, and he makes Mama smile sometimes. If you take him away, you're the bad man, not him." The deputies exchanged glances. The older one sighed heavily and looked at Mariah with something that might have been sympathy. "Ma'am, I understand you're grateful for the help, but there are laws about property ownership when Indians are involved. Regulations about, are you going to check the deed or not?" Kangi interrupted, his voice cold as the snow around them. "Because if you're not here on legitimate legal business, you're trespassing. And I have every right to defend my property against trespassers." The threat hung in the air, unsubtle and absolutely serious. The deputy clearly recognized he was dealing with someone who wouldn't back down, someone who'd fought harder battles than this and survived. "We'll check the records," he said finally. "But if there's any irregularity, we'll be back. And next time we won't come alone." They turned their horses and rode away, Cullen looking back with barely concealed hostility. Mariah watched them go, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and anger. When they were finally out of sight, she turned to Kangi. "This isn't over," she said. "They'll find some excuse, some technicality. They'll come back." "I know," Kangi said grimly. "Men like that always do. They can't stand seeing someone like me having claim to anything they think belongs to them by right of being white. The deed is legitimate, but legitimacy doesn't always matter when people have already decided what they want to believe." "So what do we do?" Samuel asked, his earlier bravery giving way to fear. Kangi looked down at the boy, then at Daniel, who'd come running from the cabin when he heard raised voices, then at Mariah standing there with fire in her eyes and steel in her spine. "We prepare," he said. "We make sure every document is in order. We build our case so thoroughly that even their prejudice can't find a crack to exploit. And if that doesn't work," he paused, his jaw tightening, "then we fight. But we do it together." Mariah nodded, feeling the weight of the battle ahead, but also feeling something else. The certainty that they wouldn't face it alone. That whatever came, they'd stand together against it. "Together," she agreed. That night, after the boys were asleep, Mariah and Kangi sat at the table reviewing every piece of documentation they had. The original homestead papers Thomas had filed, the deed Kangi had acquired, the judge's signature, the record of their partnership agreement Kangi had insisted they draw up and have witnessed in town. "Morrison will support us," Kangi said. "He owes me his life, and he's one of the few honest men in the territory. But if they get a federal marshal involved, if they escalate this to a question of Indian rights versus settler rights, even he might not be able to help." "Then we need more than legal documents," Mariah said. "We need people willing to testify that you're not a threat, that this arrangement is legitimate. The general store owner in town, he knows we've been buying supplies together. The blacksmith worked with you on the barn reinforcements. They've seen how we operate, white witnesses testifying for an Indian." Kangi's voice was skeptical. "That's asking a lot in current times." "Then we ask a lot," Mariah replied firmly, "because the alternative is losing everything we've built. And I'm not willing to accept that."
"Are you?"
Kangi looked at her across the table, at the determination in her face, at the stubborn refusal to give up that he'd come to recognize as her core strength. "No," he said quietly. "I'm not willing to accept that." They worked late into the night, planning and preparing, building their defense against an attack they knew was coming, but couldn't predict the exact form of. Outside, the snow glittered under a bright moon, beautiful and cold and indifferent to the human struggles playing out beneath its light. In his bed, behind the curtain, Samuel lay awake, listening to the low murmur of adult voices, and made a decision. Tomorrow, he would ride to town with Mr. Kangi. He would stand up in front of whoever needed to hear it and tell them the truth about what kind of man Kangi was. He was only 8 years old, but he understood that sometimes children had to be brave when adults were being stupid. And in his own small bed, Daniel clutched the fossil stone Kangi had given him and dreamed of a future where nobody had to leave, where his family stayed whole and safe, where the man who'd become like a second father didn't get taken away by men with badges and guns and hearts full of fear. The storm had passed, but a different kind of storm was gathering on the horizon. And this one wouldn't be fought with shovels and firewood, but with words and law and the fragile hope that justice might, for once, overcome prejudice. The town of Redemption sat like a collection of wooden bones scattered across the prairie. 24 buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. Kangi had avoided it as much as possible since arriving in the territory, knowing that his presence made people nervous, and nervous people did stupid things. But today there was no choice. They needed allies, and allies required face-to-face conversations that couldn't be avoided. Mariah sat beside him on the wagon seat, her best dress on despite the cold, her hair pinned up properly for the first time in weeks. Samuel and Daniel rode in the back, bundled in blankets, their faces serious, with the understanding that today mattered in ways they couldn't fully grasp. The road into town had been cleared enough by other travelers that the wagon made decent time, though the horses labored through the deeper drifts. They attracted stares the moment they arrived. Kangi felt the weight of eyes following them as they made their way down the main street, heard the conversations that stopped abruptly when they passed, saw the way mothers pulled their children closer. He'd expected it, had armored himself against it years ago, but he still felt the familiar burn of anger in his gut at being treated like a dangerous animal rather than a man. Their first stop was the land office, a narrow building squeezed between the bank and a dry goods store. Inside, a clerk with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that magnified his eyes looked up from his ledger with obvious surprise at seeing an Indian walk through his door. "We need to verify a land claim," Mariah said, before the clerk could form whatever objection was clearly forming in his mind. "Filed under the name Kangi, Apache claimant, for the property currently known as the Kern Homestead." Judge Morrison signed the deed transfer. The clerk's magnified eyes blinked several times. "That's highly irregular," he said. "Indian land claims require extensive documentation and approval from the Bureau of Indian Affairs." I'm not aware of any such. Then look it up, Kangi said, his voice carrying enough edge that the clerk actually flinched. The deed was filed properly 2 months ago. If your records don't show it, that's a problem with your record keeping, not with my claim. The clerk made a show of searching through various ledgers and files, moving with deliberate slowness that Kangi recognized as bureaucratic resistance. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he pulled out a document and laid it on the counter. There is a filing here, he admitted, but the notation says it's under review pending verification of tribal status and— There's no review period mentioned in territorial law, Mariah interrupted, having studied the regulations thoroughly over the past few days. A properly signed deed from a territorial judge is valid upon filing. Any attempt to delay or invalidate it requires formal legal challenge, which must be filed in writing and argued before the same judge who signed the original document. Has such a challenge been filed? The clerk's expression soured. Not that I'm aware of, he said stiffly. Then we need certified copies of the deed and the filing record, Mariah continued. 3 copies of each, official seals dated today. We'll wait. The clerk looked like he wanted to refuse, but there was no legal ground for him to stand on. With visible irritation, he began preparing the copies, each movement precise and resentful. Kangi stood silently, his presence a reminder that this wasn't a request that would be ignored. While they waited, Samuel tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mama, why is that man being mean to Mr. Kangi?" The clerk's face reddened, but Mariah's expression remained neutral as she answered her son. "Because some people are afraid of things they don't understand, Samuel. And fear makes people small and cruel. It's a weakness, not a strength." The copies were ready within 20 minutes, sealed and official. Mariah paid the fee, which the clerk accepted with poor grace, and they left with the documentation secured in a leather folder. One small victory, but Kangi knew the real battles were still ahead. Their next stop was the general store, where the owner, a weathered man named Jameson, had always been cordially neutral in his dealings with them. The store was crowded with townspeople stocking up after the storm, and conversations died as Mariah and Kangi entered. Daniel pressed close to his mother's side, made nervous by all the staring faces. Jameson looked up from weighing flour for a customer, and his expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Kern," he acknowledged. "Kangi, what can I do for you?" "We need to speak with you privately," Mariah said. "It's important." The storekeeper glanced around at his other customers, clearly calculating the cost of being seen in private conversation with an Indian against whatever business relationship he had with the Kern family. Finally, he jerked his head toward the back room.
5 minutes, he said.
In the cluttered storage area behind the counter, surrounded by crates and barrels, Mariah explained the situation while Kangi stood silent, letting her take the lead. She told Jameson about the deputy's visit, about the challenges to Kangi's legal claim, about the need for character witnesses who could testify that their partnership was legitimate and beneficial. Jameson listened with his arms crossed, his face revealing nothing. When Mariah finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "You're asking me to stand up in front of a territorial court and say that an Apache has the right to own land, to testify that you're not being coerced or manipulated. You understand what that'll cost me?" "Yes," Mariah said simply. "It'll cost you the respect of people who value prejudice over truth. It'll cost you customers who think supporting an Indian makes you a traitor to your own kind. It might cost you threats, or worse, from people who see any challenge to their worldview as an attack. I know what we're asking, but I also know you've dealt fairly with us from the beginning, that you've never cheated us on weight or price, that you're a man who believes in honest business. I'm asking you to extend that honesty beyond the counter." Jameson's jaw worked silently. He looked at Kangi. "You got anything to say for yourself?" "Oh, no," Kangi replied. "Either you're the kind of man who'll do what's right even when it's hard, or you're not. Nothing I say will change that." The storekeeper's eyes narrowed, but there was something almost like respect in his expression. "You got stones, I'll give you that," he said. Then he sighed heavily. "Look, I can't testify in court. I've got a family to think about, a business that barely makes ends meet as it is. I can't afford to become a target." Mariah's shoulders slumped slightly, but Kangi had expected this. Most people, when it came down to it, chose safety over principle. He couldn't even blame them for it, but Jameson continued, "I can write a letter, sworn statement, witnessed by the notary, saying that every dealing I've had with you both has been honest and fair, that you pay your debts, work your land, and conduct yourselves like any other partnership I've done business with. It's not testimony, but it's something. Best I can offer." It was more than Kangi had expected. Mariah's face brightened with cautious hope. "That would help," she said. "More than you know." They left the store with Jameson's promise to have the letter ready by the next day, a small victory that felt larger than it probably was. But as they emerged onto the boardwalk, they found themselves facing a group of men who'd clearly been waiting for them. Cullen stood at the center, flanked by 4 others that Kangi recognized as local ranchers, and one who wore the dusty clothes of a railroad surveyor. Their body language was aggressive, territorial, the stance of men who felt entitled to intimidate. "Kern," Cullen said, deliberately ignoring Kangi's presence. "We need to talk about your situation. For your own good." Mariah moved Samuel and Daniel behind her instinctively. "I have nothing to discuss with you, Mr. Cullen. My business is my own. Your business becomes our business when you're harboring a hostile on land that rightfully belongs to civilized settlement," the surveyor spoke up. His accent was Eastern, educated, which somehow made his words more offensive. "The railroad has plans for this territory, plans that require stability and security. Indians with property claims disrupt that stability." "I'm not hostile," Kangi said quietly, each word measured. "I'm standing on a public street conducting legal business. If you have a problem with my land claim, file a challenge through proper channels. If you have a problem with my presence in town, take it up with the sheriff. Otherwise, step aside." "The sheriff answers to the town council," Cullen said. "And the council answers to property owners like us. You think a piece of paper from Morrison protects you? Morrison's authority doesn't extend beyond his courtroom, and even that's questionable these days. You're living on borrowed time, Indian. Take whatever money she's fool enough to give you and disappear before things get unpleasant." Samuel pushed past his mother before Mariah could stop him, his young face flushed with anger. "Mr. Kangi isn't going anywhere. He's part of our family, and you can't make him leave." The men laughed, the sound cruel and dismissive. "Listen to the boy," one of them said. "Already corrupted by savage influence. This is exactly what we're talking about." Kangi felt his control beginning to fray, felt the old rage rising up from the place where he'd buried it. His hand moved toward the knife at his belt, not drawing it, but resting there in clear warning. The laughter stopped abruptly. Several of the men reached for their own weapons. "Enough!" A new voice cut through the tension. Judge Morrison pushed through the crowd, his considerable bulk and official authority parting the men like water around a stone. "What's going on here?" "Oh, just a friendly conversation, Judge," Cullen said, his tone artificially pleasant. "Expressing our concerns about the, unusual situation at the Kern property." Morrison's eyes were sharp, despite his age. "Unusual how?" "From what I can see, Mrs. Kern has entered into a legal partnership with a man who holds legitimate title to the land in question. A title I personally verified and approved. Are you questioning my judgment, Cullen?" The rancher's face reddened. "Of course not, Judge, but there are concerns about safety. About the fact that you've been trying to buy that property for 3 years and Mrs. Kern kept refusing to sell." Morrison interrupted. "About the fact that having an Indian with legal land rights sets a precedent that makes your own claims to former tribal lands slightly less secure. About the fact that you're worried progress might mean treating all men equally under the law, regardless of race. Those concerns?" The silence was thick with resentment. The surveyor tried once more. "Judge Morrison, with respect, the railroad has invested significant capital in this territory, based on assurances that land would be available for development. Indians with property rights complicate—" "The law complicates your plans, you mean," Morrison said coldly. "Gentlemen, let me be very clear. The deed is legal. The partnership is legal. Any attempt to intimidate, coerce or harm either Mrs. Kern or Kangi will be met with the full force of territorial law. I may be old, but I still have authority here, and I still have friends in the territorial governor's office who take a dim view of railroad companies running roughshod over legitimate property rights. Am I making myself understood? The men muttered and shifted but didn't argue further. Morrison's reputation as a former Indian fighter, who'd later become one of the few judges willing to enforce treaty rights, made him unpredictable and therefore dangerous. They dispersed slowly, Cullen shooting one last venomous look at Kangi before walking away. "Star!" Morrison turned to Mariah and Kangi. "Walk with me," he said. They followed him to his office. A cramped room above the land office filled with law books and the smoke from his pipe. Once inside with the door closed, Morrison's stern demeanor softened slightly. "You're in trouble," he said bluntly. "Not legal trouble, the deed is solid. But you've made enemies, powerful ones with resources and connections. The railroad wants that land for a spur line, and they've already paid Cullen and his friends to acquire the properties they need." "You're an obstacle. What do you suggest?" Kangi asked. "Don't give them any excuse," Morrison said. "No fights, no confrontations, nothing they can twist into evidence that you're dangerous or unstable. Document everything. Keep records of every threat, every attempt at intimidation. And for God's sake, don't go anywhere alone. They'll try to manufacture an incident, something that justifies removing you forcibly. Don't let them—" Mariah spoke up. "Is there anything you can do officially? I can delay their legal maneuvers. Throw up procedural obstacles, make it expensive and time-consuming for them to pursue this through the courts," Morrison said. "But my authority has limits. If they go to the federal level, claim you're violating Indian policy or some such nonsense, it gets out of my hands. Your best protection is making yourselves too visible to disappear quietly. Get people on your side even if they won't testify in court. Make it politically costly to move against you." They left Morrison's office with more knowledge, but not necessarily more comfort. The ride back to the homestead was quiet, both adults lost in thought, while the boys dozed in the back of the wagon. The sun was setting by the time they reached home, painting the snow in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful if either of them had been in the mood to appreciate it. That night, after the boys were in bed, Mariah and Kangi sat at the table drinking coffee and reviewing everything that had happened. The certified deeds, Jameson's promised letter, Morrison's warnings, the very real threat that hung over them like an axe waiting to fall. "We could leave," Mariah said quietly. "Take the boys, head to California or Oregon territory. Start completely over somewhere they don't know us." Kangi looked at her in surprise. "You'd give up your home? Everything you've built here? To keep my son safe?" Mariah met his eyes. "Without hesitation. But I'd also be giving up you. This partnership, whatever it's becoming. And I don't want to do that either." The admission hung between them, more revealing than Mariah had probably intended. Kangi felt something in his chest tighten and release at the same time. "What is it becoming?" he asked softly. Mariah's hands wrapped around her coffee cup, seeking warmth or courage or both. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Something that scares me because I've already lost one person I depended on. Something that feels different than what I had with Thomas. Stronger, maybe, built on more than just necessity and convention. But also something that could be destroyed so easily by men who don't care about anything except their own interests." Kangi reached across the table, his scarred hand covering hers. "I'm not Thomas," he said. "I won't die and leave you alone. I've survived too much to be taken down by petty ranchers and corrupt surveyors. But I also won't let you sacrifice everything for me. If leaving is what keeps you and the boys safe, then we leave. Together." The word "together" resonated in the small cabin like a bell. Mariah turned her hand over beneath his, their palms touching, fingers intertwining with a naturalness that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd almost reached for each other. "I don't want to run," she said. "I've run enough. From Missouri, from poverty, from the memory of Thomas dying while I was helpless to save him. I want to stand somewhere and fight for it. I want this place to mean something more than just another temporary shelter before the next disaster. Is that foolish? No, Kangi said. It's human. It's what makes us different from animals that just react to threats. We choose what we fight for. We decide what matters enough to risk everything. This place, this partnership, your sons growing up with land and legacy instead of poverty and displacement, that's worth fighting for. They sat like that for a long time. Hands joined across the table, drawing strength from the contact. Outside, a wolf howled somewhere in the hills, and Kangi's paint stallion answered with a nervous whinny. The world was full of predators, human and animal, all looking for weakness to exploit. But inside the cabin, two people who'd been broken by that world were choosing to stand together against it. Choosing to believe that sometimes, despite all evidence to the contrary, strength could come from connection rather than isolation. That survival didn't have to mean being alone. We'll need to teach the boys to shoot, Kangi said eventually, practical considerations reasserting themselves. Not to kill, but to defend. Samuel's old enough to learn rifle basics at least. And we should cache supplies in the hills, places we can retreat to if things go bad here. Mariah nodded, her strategic mind engaging. I'll talk to the women in town, the ones who buy eggs from us. Build quiet support among the people who actually benefit from our work, rather than see us as competition. And we should document everything we do. Keep journals showing the improvements to the land, the productivity increases. Make it clear we're not squatters or opportunists, but legitimate operators. They planned late into the night, building their defense layer by layer, preparing for battles they hoped wouldn't come, but knew probably would. When they finally separated to sleep, Kangi to his bedroll by the fire, and Mariah to her small bed behind the partition, they both lay awake thinking about the same things. About how quickly something good could be destroyed by people who couldn't tolerate anything that challenged their assumptions about how the world should work. About whether love, if that's what this growing thing between them was, could survive under the pressure of external threats and internal fears. About whether two people from such different worlds could really build something lasting, or if they were just delaying the inevitable collapse. But they also thought about Samuel's excitement as he learned new skills. About Daniel's innocent belief that good people didn't get hurt if they were brave. About the satisfaction of seeing crops grow and buildings stand solid and animals thrive under proper care. About moments of peace in a harsh world, earned through work and defended through will. Those thoughts weren't answers, but they were enough to hold on to through the dark hours until dawn. Enough to face whatever tomorrow brought with something that looked, if you squinted right, almost like hope. Spring came late to the Oklahoma Territory that year, winter clinging stubbornly to the land until mid-April, when the ice finally broke and the creeks ran high with snowmelt. The homestead had survived the long, cold months intact, a testament to the preparations Kangi and Mariah had made together. The animals were healthy, the buildings stood solid, and the boys had grown taller and stronger on regular meals. But survival and peace were not the same thing. The threats from Cullen and the railroad interests hadn't disappeared. Mariah felt them like a weight pressing down on everything they did, a constant awareness that their fragile stability could shatter at any moment. Riders passed by the property more frequently than seemed natural, always watching with calculating eyes before moving on. The morning everything changed started ordinary enough. Kangi and Samuel were repairing fence line on the northern boundary, while Mariah worked in the garden plot, preparing soil for spring planting. Daniel played nearby, building elaborate structures with stones and sticks. The sun was warm for the first time in months, and there was actual hope in the air. That's when the federal marshal arrived. He came alone, a tall man with iron-gray hair and military bearing, riding a roan horse and wearing a badge that caught the sunlight. Mariah straightened from her work, soil on her hands and fear in her heart, and called out to alert Kangi. By the time the marshal reached the cabin, all four of them were standing in the yard, presenting a united front. The lawman dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Mrs. Kern," he said, touching his hat brim. I'm Marshal Wade Garrett, appointed by the territorial governor. I need to speak with you and with the man called Kangi regarding the ownership and occupation of this property. We've already been through this with the deputies, Mariah said, trying to keep her voice steady. Our documentation is in order. Judge Morrison verified everything. I'm aware of Judge Morrison's involvement, Garrett interrupted not unkindly. That's actually why I'm here. There's been a formal challenge filed with the Territorial Land Commission. The railroad company is claiming that the original Apache Land Cession Treaty included this specific parcel, and that subsequent sale to private individuals violated federal jurisdiction. They're arguing that all transactions related to this property are legally void. The words hit like physical blows. Mariah felt her legs weaken, but forced herself to stay upright. Beside her, Kangi's expression had gone completely blank. That dangerous emptiness she'd learned meant he was barely containing rage. How long? Kangi asked, his voice deadly quiet. Garrett met his eyes steadily. Could be 6 months. Could be 2 years. The Territorial Land Commission doesn't move quickly. And there's another complication. The railroad has petitioned for right-of-way to begin preliminary survey work across the property. A judge granted authorization yesterday. They're going to come onto our land. Samuel spoke up, his voice cracking with indignation. Before Garrett could respond, the sound of multiple horses reached them. They all turned to see a group of riders approaching, at least 8 men led by Cullen and the railroad surveyor. They were coming fast, kicking up dust. The riders pulled up in a semicircle around the cabin. Cullen sat his mount with obvious satisfaction. Marshal Garrett, he said with false courtesy, we're here to begin the survey work, as authorized by the territorial court. Samuel suddenly darted forward, putting himself between the riders and his mother. This is our home, he shouted, his young voice shaking with fury and fear. You can't just take it. We worked for it. We fixed everything. You're thieves using the law to steal. Ah, Kangi moved then, faster than Mariah had ever seen him move. He scooped Samuel up with one arm and stood facing the riders with his other hand resting on his knife. You want to survey? He said, his voice carrying absolute clarity. Then come down off those horses and walk this land on foot. See the buildings we repaired? Count the animals we raised from nothing. Look at what we created here, and then tell me you have more right to it than we do. Mariah stepped forward, forcing her voice to stay level. Marshal Garrett, we're not going to resist the legal process. But if you want to maintain order, tell these men to come back tomorrow with proper respect. If they try to force their way onto our property today, right now, while our children are frightened, then whatever happens next is on them. Garrett studied her for a long moment, then turned to Cullen. She's right. You've delivered your message. Now back off and give them until morning. Cullen looked like he wanted to argue, but even he recognized that pushing further would undermine their position. Tomorrow morning, he said through gritted teeth. But if there's any interference, we'll have federal charges filed. They rode off, leaving the 5 people standing in the yard. After Garrett left with promises to return in the morning, the 4 of them stood in silence. Daniel had started crying quietly. Samuel's face was set in angry lines. Mariah felt numb. It was Kangi who finally moved, gathering all of them together in an awkward group embrace. Listen to me, he said, his voice rough with emotion. This isn't over. We keep working, keep documenting everything. We make it as expensive and complicated as possible for them to push us out. We don't give up, but what if we lose anyway? Samuel asked, the question every adult was thinking. Kangi looked at the boy steadily. Then we lose having fought with everything we had. We lose knowing we didn't surrender. And we take with us the knowledge that we built something good here, even if they tear it down after we're gone. That matters. That night, after the boys were finally asleep, Mariah and Kangi sat outside on the porch, despite the chill. The stars were brilliant overhead, indifferent to human suffering. I'm sorry, Kangi said suddenly. This is my fault. If I'd never filed that deed, they wouldn't have this excuse. Stop, Mariah said sharply. You saved us. Before you came, we were starving. The homestead was falling apart. You gave us hope, taught us skills. Whatever happens now, we had this time. That's not nothing. It's not enough, Kangi said, and she heard the pain in his voice. I couldn't save my family, couldn't save my people, and now I can't save you. Mariah reached over and took his hand. Then don't watch it get destroyed, she said firmly. Help me fight. We find every legal loophole, every procedural delay. We make them work for this, and if that's not enough, Kangi asked, then we leave together, Mariah said with absolute certainty. All four of us. We go somewhere they can't follow, and we do it as a family. Because that's what we've become. Kangi turned to look at her, his dark eyes searching her face in the starlight. You mean that? I do, Mariah replied. What I feel when I look at you is different than what I had with Thomas. Deeper, built on respect and shared struggle. I don't know what to call it, but I know I don't want to lose it. The kiss, when it came, felt inevitable. Gentle at first, then deeper, carrying all the fear and hope and desperate need for connection. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. I never thought I'd have this again, Kangi said hoarsely. Someone to care about who cared back. A reason to build instead of destroy. Then we fight for it, Mariah said firmly. Together, the next 3 weeks were brutal. Surveyors tramped across their land with armed escorts, while Marshal Garrett maintained order. Mariah and Samuel documented everything, building a record of harassment and intimidation, but the legal machinery ground forward with inexorable momentum. On the 21st day, Garrett returned with the final blow. The railroad had filed for immediate possession. They had 30 days to vacate, 30 days. 1 month to abandon everything they'd built. That evening, Mariah sat at the table reviewing their impossible options. They could appeal and probably lose. They could resist and be destroyed, or they could accept reality and start over. California, Kangi said quietly, unfolding a worn map. I have contacts there, Apache, who found work on ranches. There's land available for homesteading in the valleys, better climate, fewer railroads pushing west. We could try again, could we really? Samuel asked from his place by the fire. Just leave and pretend this never happened? No, Kangi admitted. We'll never forget this place. But we take what it taught us and use it somewhere else. That's making sure it meant something. Your father used to say that land was just dirt until people made it into something more, Mariah said softly. What makes a place home isn't the ground or the buildings. It's the people who live there and what they build together. We can build that again, Samuel. It won't be the same, but it can still be good. Over the next 4 weeks, they prepared to leave with methodical determination. They sold what animals they couldn't take, packed tools and supplies, sorted through possessions, deciding what was essential and what had to be abandoned. Judge Morrison came 3 days before their deadline, looking older and worn down. I fought this as hard as I could, he told them, his voice heavy with defeat. But the territorial governor is in the railroad's pocket, and without his support, I don't have the authority to stop this. I'm sorry, he pulled out an envelope. There's $300 here. Railroad money they paid me in bribes last year. Take it, start your new life. And when you're settled, when you've built something good again, write to me. Let me know you made it. They took the money because pride was a luxury they couldn't afford on their last morning. They stood together in the yard one final time as the sun rose over land that would never be theirs again. The cabin looked the same as always, solid and weathered. The barn stood straight and strong. The garden plot waited for seeds that other hands might plant. I hate leaving, Daniel said, clutching his fossil stone. This is home. Home is where we make it, Mariah said, though her own heart was breaking. And we'll make it again somewhere new. All of us together, as a family, they loaded the wagon one last time, checking the horses that would carry them west. As the sun climbed higher, 4 people turned their backs on everything they'd built and everything they'd lost. Kangi took the reins, Mariah beside him, the boys in the back surrounded by their remaining possessions. As the wagon began to roll, Samuel looked back one last time at the homestead growing smaller in the distance. Eyes forward, son, Kangi said gently. What's behind us is gone. What's ahead is what we make of it. The journey west took nearly 3 months. They traveled with other families heading to California, strength in numbers against bandits and harsh weather. The boys learned to handle horses better, to read trail signs, to survive on limited rations. Gangi taught them Apache ways of finding water and edible plants. Mariah kept their spirits up with stories and songs from her own childhood. When they finally crossed into California in late summer, the valleys spread before them green and vast, so different from the Oklahoma plains. They filed a homestead claim in a region still open for settlement. Far from railroad interests and closer to the ocean where the climate was gentler, the new land required different skills, but they had experience now. They knew how to work together, how to read soil and seasons, how to build structures that would last. Samuel and Daniel were stronger, capable of real work. And Gangi and Mariah had each other, a partnership that had evolved into something deeper. 6 months after arriving, they stood in front of their new cabin, smaller than the one they'd left but sturdy and well-built. The barn was functional, the garden plot showing promise. Animals grazed in the corral, and smoke rose from the chimney into the clear California sky. "It's not the same," Samuel said, but his voice carried acceptance rather than bitterness. "No," Gangi agreed, "it's better. Because we built it knowing what we were fighting for. We built it together as a family, with no one able to take it from us." That evening, Mariah sat at their new table and wrote a letter to Judge Morrison. She told him they'd survived the journey, found good land, started again. She told him the boys were thriving and that she and Gangi had married in a small ceremony in Sacramento. She told him that what had been stolen from them in Oklahoma had taught them something valuable. That loss had made them stronger rather than breaking them. Daniel came running in from outside, his face flushed with excitement. "Mama, Mr. Gangi says tomorrow we can go to the ocean. He says I can see water that goes on forever." Mariah looked at Gangi standing in the doorway, backlit by the setting sun, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not just contentment or survival, but actual happiness. The kind that came from building something real with people you loved. "Then tomorrow we'll go see the ocean," she said, pulling Daniel close. As a family, Gangi moved to join them, Samuel trailing behind him. And they stood together in their new home, surrounded by evidence of what they'd created from nothing but determination and hope. The land they'd lost was gone, torn apart by railroad greed and corrupt law. But what they'd built couldn't be destroyed by distance or injustice. They carried it with them in their skills, their strength, their bond. They were home, not because of where they were, but because of who they'd become. A family forged in hardship, tempered by loss, and made stronger by the simple choice to stand together against everything that tried to break them apart. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.